Section 39 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Seascape with Frieze of Girls, Part 6. The effort made by Elster to strip himself, when face to face with reality, of every intellectual concept, was all the more admirable in that this man, who before sitting down to paint made himself deliberately ignorant, forgot in his honesty of purpose everything that he knew, since what one knows ceases to exist by itself, had in reality an exceptionally cultivated mind. When I confessed to him the disappointment that I had felt upon seeing the porch at Baalbec, "What?" he had exclaimed. "You were disappointed by the porch? Why, it's the finest illustrated Bible that the people have ever had. That Virgin and all the bas reliefs telling the story of her life, they are the most loving, the most inspired expressions of that endless poem of adoration and praise in which the Middle Ages extolled the glory of the Madonna. If you only knew, side by side with the most scrupulous accuracy in rendering the sacred text, what exquisite ideas the old carver had, what profound thoughts, what delicious poetry. A wonderful idea, that great sheet in which the angels are carrying the body of the Virgin, too sacred for them to venture to touch it with their hands. I had mentioned to him that this theme had been treated also at St. André des Champs. He had seen photographs of the porch there, and agreed, but pointed out that the bustling activity of those little peasant figures, all hurrying at once towards the Virgin, was not the same thing as the gravity of those two great angels, almost Italian, so springing, so gentle. The angel who is carrying the Virgin's soul to reunite it with her body. In the meeting of the Virgin with Elizabeth, Elizabeth's gesture when she touches the Virgin's womb and marvels to feel that it is great with child, and the bandaged arm of the midwife who had refused, unless she touched, to believe the Immaculate Conception, and the linen cloth thrown by the Virgin to St. Thomas to give him a proof of the resurrection. That veil, too, which the Virgin tears from her own bosom to cover the nakedness of her Son, from whose side the Church receives in a chalice the wine of the sacrament, while on his other side the synagogue, whose kingdom is at an end, has its eyes bandaged, holds a half-broken scepter and lets fall, with the crown that is slipping from its head, the tables of the old law, and the husband who, on the day of judgment, as he helps his young wife to rise from her grave, lays her hand against his own heart to reassure her, to prove to her that it is indeed beating. Is that such a trumpery idea, do you think, so stale and commonplace? And the angel who is taking away the sun and the moon, henceforth useless, since it is written that the light of the cross shall be 7 times brighter than the light of the firmament, and the one who is dipping his hand in the water of the child's bath to see whether it is warm enough, and the one emerging from the clouds to place the crown upon the Virgin's brow, and all the angels who are leaning from the vault of heaven, between the balusters of the New Jerusalem, and throwing up their arms with terror or joy at the sight of the torments of the wicked or the bliss of the elect. For it is all the circles of heaven, a whole gigantic poem full of theology and symbolism that you have before you there. It is fantastic, mad, divine, 1,000 times better than anything you will see in Italy, where, for that matter, this very tympanum has been carefully copied by sculptors with far less genius. There never was a time when genius was universal. That is all nonsense. It would be going beyond the age of gold. The fellow who carved that front, you may make up your mind that he was every bit as great, that he had just as profound ideas as the men you admire most at the present day. I could show you what I mean if we went there together. There are certain passages from the Office of the Assumption which have been rendered with a subtlety of expression that Redon himself has never equaled. This vast celestial vision of which he spoke to me, this gigantic theological poem which, I understood, had been inscribed there in stone, yet when my eyes, big with desire, had opened to gaze upon the front of Baalbec Church, it was not these things that I had seen. I spoke to him of those great statues of saints, which, mounted on scaffolds, formed a sort of avenue on either side. It starts from the mists of antiquity to end in Jesus Christ, he explained. You see on one side his ancestors after the spirit, on the other the kings of Judah, his ancestors after the flesh. All of the ages are there. and if you had looked more closely at what you took for scaffolds, you would have been able to give names to the figures standing on them. At the feet of Moses you would have recognized the calf of gold, at Abraham's the ram, at Joseph's the demon counseling Potiphar's wife. I told him also that I had gone there expecting to find an almost Persian building, and that this had doubtless been one of the chief factors in my disappointment. Indeed, no, he reassured me. It is perfectly true. Some parts of it are quite Oriental. One of the capitals reproduces so exactly a Persian subject that you cannot account for it by the persistence of Oriental traditions. The carver must have copied some casket brought from the East by explorers. And he did indeed show me, later on, the photograph of a capital on which I saw dragons that were almost Chinese, devouring one another. But at Baalbek this little piece of carving had passed unnoticed by me in the general effect of the building, which did not conform to the pattern traced in my mind by the words, "an almost Persian church." The intellectual pleasures which I enjoyed in this studio did not in the least prevent me from feeling, although they enveloped us as it were in spite of ourselves, the warm polish, the sparkling gloom of the place itself, and through the little window framed in honeysuckle, in the avenue that was quite rustic, the resisting dryness of the sun-parched earth, screened only by the diaphanous gauze woven of distance and of a tree-cast shade. Perhaps the unaccountable feeling of comfort which this summer day was giving me came like a tributary to swell the flood of joy that had surged in me at the sight of Elster's Carthahuit harbor. I had supposed Elster to be a modest man, but I realized my mistake on seeing his face cloud with melancholy when, in a little speech of thanks, I uttered the word fame. Men who believe that their work will last, as was the case with Elster, form the habit of placing that work in a period when they themselves will have crumbled into dust. And thus, by obliging them to reflect on their own extinction, the thought of fame saddens them because it is inseparable from the thought of death. I changed the conversation in the hope of driving away the cloud of ambitious melancholy with which I unwittingly had loaded Elster's brow. "Someone advised me once," I began, thinking of the conversation we had had with Legrandin at Combray, as to which I was glad of an opportunity of learning Elster's views, "not to visit Brittany because it would not be wholesome for a mind with a natural tendency to dream." "Not at all," he replied. "When the mind has a tendency to dream, it is a mistake to keep dreams away from it, to ration its dreams. So long as you distract your mind from its dreams, it will not know them for what they are. You will always be being taken in by the appearance of things, because you will not have grasped their true nature. If a little dreaming is dangerous, the cure for it is not to dream less, but to dream more, to dream all the time. One must have a thorough understanding of one's dreams if one is not to be troubled by them. There is a way of separating one's dreams from one's life which so often produces good results that I ask myself whether one ought not, at all costs, to try it, simply as a preventative, just as certain surgeons make out that we ought, to avoid the risk of appendicitis later on, to have all our appendices taken out when we are children. Elster and I had meanwhile been walking about the studio and had reached the window that looked across the garden on to a narrow avenue, a side street that was almost a country lane. We had gone there to breathe the cooler air of the late afternoon. I supposed myself to be nowhere near the girls of the little band, and it was only by sacrificing for once the hope of seeing them that I had yielded to my grandmother's prayers and had gone to see Elster. For where the thing is to be found that we are seeking, we never know, and often we steadily, for a long time, avoid the place which, for quite different reasons, everyone has been asking us to go. But we never suspect that we shall there see the very person of whom we are thinking. I looked out vaguely over the country road, which outside the studio passed quite close to it, but did not belong to Elster. Suddenly there appeared on it, coming along it at a rapid pace, the young bicyclist of the little band, with, over her dark hair, her polo cap pulled down toward her plump cheeks, her eyes merry and almost importunate, and on that auspicious path, miraculously filled with promise of delights, I saw her beneath the trees throw to Elster the smiling greeting of a friend, a rainbow that bridged the gulf for me between our terraqueous world and regions which I had hitherto regarded as inaccessible. She even came up to give her hand to the painter, though without stopping, and I could see that she had a tiny beauty spot on her chin. "Do you know that girl, sir?" I asked Elster, realizing that he could, if he chose, make me known to her, could invite us both to the house. And this peaceful studio with its rural horizon was at once filled with a surfeit of delight, such as a child might feel in a house where he was already happily playing when he learned that in addition, out of that bounteousness which enables lovely things and noble hosts to increase their gifts beyond all measure, there was being prepared for him a sumptuous repast. Elster told me that she was called Albertine Simonet, and gave me the names also of her friends, whom I described to him with sufficient accuracy for him to identify them almost without hesitation. I had, with regard to their social position, made a mistake, but not the mistake that I usually made at Balbec. I was always ready to take for princes the sons of shopkeepers when they appeared on horseback. This time I had placed in an interloping class the daughters of a set of respectable people, extremely rich, belonging to the world of industry and business. It was the class which, on first thoughts, interested me least, since it held for me neither the mystery of the lower orders nor that of a society such as the Guermantes frequented. And no doubt, if an inherent quality, a rank which they could never forfeit, had not been conferred on them, in my dazzled eyes, by the glaring vacuity of the seaside life all around them, I should perhaps have not succeeded in resisting and overcoming the idea that they were the daughters of prosperous merchants. I could not help marveling to see how the French middle class was a wonderful studio full of sculpture of the noblest and most varied kind. What unimagined types, what richness of invention in the character of their faces, what firmness, what freshness, what simplicity in their features. The shrewd old money-changers from whose loins these Dianas and these nymphs had sprung seemed to me to have been the greatest of statuaries. Before I had time to register the social metamorphosis of these girls, so are these discoveries of a mistake, these modifications of the notion one has of a person instantaneous as a chemical combination. There was already installed behind their faces, so street Arab in type that I had taken them for the mistresses of racing bicyclists, of boxing champions, the idea that they might easily be connected with the family of some lawyer or other whom we knew. I was barely conscious of what was meant by Albertine Simonet. She had certainly no conception of what she was one day to mean to me. Even the name Simonet, which I had already heard spoken on the beach, if I had been asked to write it down, I should have spelt with a double N, never dreaming of the importance which this family attached to there being but one in their name. In proportion as we descend the social scale, our snobbishness fastens on to mere nothings which are perhaps no more null than the distinctions observed by the aristocracy, but being more obscure, more peculiar to the individual, take us more by surprise. Possibly there had been Simonets who had done badly in business, or something worse still even. The fact remains that the Simonets never failed, it appeared, to be annoyed if anyone doubled their N. They wore the air of being the only Simonets in the world with one N instead of two, and were as proud of it, perhaps, as the Montmorency family were of being the premier barons of France. I asked Elster whether these girls lived at Balbec. Yes, he told me, some of them at any rate. The villa in which one of them lived was at that very spot, right at the end of the beach, where the cliffs of Kennepville began. As this girl was a great friend of Albertine Simonet, this was another reason for me to believe that it was indeed the latter whom I had met that day when I was with my grandmother. There were, of course, so many of those little streets running down to the beach, and all at the same angle, that I could not have pointed out exactly which of them it had been. One would like always to remember a thing accurately, but at the time one's vision was clouded. And yet that Albertine and the girl whom I had seen going to her friend's house were one and the same person was a practical certainty. In spite of which, whereas the countless images that have since been furnished me by the dark young golfer, however different they may have been from one another, have overlaid one another, because I now know that they all belong to her, and if I retrace the thread of my memories, I can, under cover of that identity, and as though along a tunneled passage, pass through all those images in turn without losing my consciousness of the same person behind them all. If, on the other hand, I wish to revert to the girl whom I passed that day when I was with my grandmother, I must escape first into freer air. I am convinced that it is Albertine whom I find there, the same girl as her who would often stop dead among her moving comrades, in her walk along the foreground of the sea. But all those more recent images remain separate from that earlier one because I am unable to confer on her retrospectively an identity which she had not for me at the moment in which she caught my eye. Whatever assurance I may derive from the law of probabilities, that girl with plump cheeks who stared at me so boldly from the angle of the little street and the beach, and by whom I believe that I might have been loved, I have never, in the strict sense of the words, seen again. My hesitation between the different girls of the little band, all of whom retained something of the collective charm which had at first disturbed me, combined with the reasons already given to allow me later on, even at the time of my greater, my second, passion for Albertine, a sort of intermittent and very brief liberty to abstain from loving her. From having strayed among all her friends before it finally concentrated itself on her, my love kept, now and then, between itself and the image of Albertine, a certain play of light and shade which enabled it, like a badly fitted lamp, to flit over the surface of each of the others before settling its focus upon her. The connection between the pain which I felt in my heart and the memory of Albertine did not seem to me necessary. I might perhaps have managed to coordinate it with the image of another person, which enabled me, in a momentary flash, to banish reality altogether, not only external reality, as in my love for Gilbert, which I had recognized to be an internal state in which I drew from myself alone the particular quality, the special character of the person whom I loved, everything that rendered her indispensable to my happiness, but even the other reality, internal and purely subjective. Not a day passes but one or the other of them comes by here and looks in for a minute or two, Elster told me, plunging me in despair when I thought that if I had gone to see him at once, when my grandmother had begged me to do so, I should, in all probability, long since have made Albertine's acquaintance. She had passed on. From the studio she was no longer in sight. I supposed that she had gone to join her friends on the front. Could I have appeared there suddenly with Elster, I should have got to know them all. I thought of endless pretexts for inducing him to take a turn with me on the beach. I had no longer the same peace of mind as before the apparition of the girl in the frame of the little window, so charming until then in its fringe of honeysuckle, and now so drearily empty. Elster caused me a joy that was tormenting also when he said that he would go a little way with me, but that he must first finish the piece of work on which he was engaged. It was a flower study, but not one of any of the flowers, portraits of which I would rather have commissioned him to paint than the portrait of a person, so that I might learn from the revelation of his genius what I had so often sought in vain from the flowers themselves: hawthorn white and pink, cornflowers, apple blossom. Elster, as he worked, talked botany to me, but I scarcely listened. He was no longer sufficient in himself. He was now only the necessary intermediary between these girls and me. The distinction which, only a few moments ago, his talent had still given him in my eyes, was now worthless save in so far as it might confer a little on me also in the eyes of the little band to whom I should be presented by him. I paced up and down the room, impatient for him to finish what he was doing. I picked up and examined various sketches, any number of which were stacked against the walls. In this way I happened to bring to light a water-color which evidently belonged to a much earlier period in Elster's life, and gave me that particular kind of enchantment which is diffused by works of art not only deliciously executed, but representing a subject so singular and so seductive, that it is to it that we attribute a great deal of their charm, as if the charm were something that the painter had merely to uncover, to observe, realized already in a material form by nature, and to reproduce in art. That such objects can exist, beautiful quite apart from the painter's interpretation of them, satisfies a sort of innate materialism in us, against which our reason contends and acts as a counterpoise to the abstractions of aesthetics. It was, this watercolor, the portrait of a young woman, by no means beautiful, but of a curious type, in a close-fitting mob cap, not unlike a billycock hat, trimmed with a ribbon of cherry-colored silk. In one of her mittened hands was a lighted cigarette, while the other held, level with her knee, a sort of broad-rimmed garden hat, nothing more than a fire screen of plaited straw to keep off the sun. On a table by her side a tall vase filled with pink carnations. Often, and it was the case here, the singularity of such works is due principally to their having been executed in special conditions for which we do not at first sight make proper allowance. If, for instance, the strange attire of a feminine model is her costume for a masked ball, or conversely the scarlet cloak which an elderly man looks as though he had put on to humor some whim in the painter, is his gown as a professor or alderman, or his cardinal's cassock. The ambiguous character of the person whose portrait now confronted me arose, without my understanding it, from the fact that she was a young actress of an earlier generation half dressed for a part. But the cap or hat, beneath which the hair stuck out but was cut short, the velvet coat opening without lapels over a white shirt front, made me hesitate as to the period of the clothes and the sex of the model, so that I did not know what it was exactly that I was holding before my eyes, unless simply the brightest colored of these scraps of painting. And the pleasure which it afforded me was disturbed only by the fear that Elster, by delaying further, would make me miss the girls, for the sun was now declining and hung low in the little window. Nothing in this watercolor was merely stated there as a fact and painted because of its utility to the composition. The costume because the young woman must be wearing something, the vase to hold the flowers. The glass of the vase, cherished for its own sake, seemed to be holding the water in which the stems of the carnations were dipped in something as limpid, almost as liquid as itself. The woman's dress encompassed her in a manner that had an independent, a brotherly charm, and if the works of man can compete in charm with the wonders of nature, as delicate, as pleasing to the touch of the eye, as freshly painted as the fur of a cat, the petals of a flower, the feathers of a dove. The whiteness of the shirt front, fine as driven rain, with its gay pleats gathered into little bells like lilies of the valley, was starred with bright gleams of light from the room, as sharply edged and as finely shaded as though they had been posies of flowers stitched on the woven lawn. And the velvet of the coat, brilliant with a milky sheen, had here and there a roughness, a scoring, a shagginess on its surface, which made one think of the crumpled brightness of the carnations in the vase. But above all, one felt that Elster, sublimely indifferent to whatever immoral suggestion there might be in this disguise of a young actress for whom the talent with which she would play her part on the stage was doubtless of less importance than the irritant attraction which she would offer to the jaded or depraved senses of some of her audience, had, on the contrary, fastened upon those ambiguous points as on an aesthetic element which deserved to be brought into prominence, and which he had done everything in his power to emphasize. Along the lines of the face, the latent sex seemed to be on the point of confessing itself to be that of a somewhat boyish girl, then vanished and farther on reappeared with a suggestion rather of an effeminate youth, vicious and pensive, then fled once more to remain uncapturable. The dreamy sadness in the expression of her eyes, by the mere fact of its contrast with the accessories belonging to the world of love-making and play-acting, was not the least disturbing element in the picture. One imagined, moreover, that it must be feigned, and that the young person who seemed ready to submit to caresses in this provoking costume had probably thought it effective to enhance the provocation with this romantic expression of a secret longing, an unspoken grief. At the foot of the picture was inscribed, Miss Sacripant, October 1872. I could not contain my admiration. Oh, it's nothing. Only a rough sketch I did when I was young. It was a costume for a variety show. It's all ages ago now. And what has become of the model? A bewilderment provoked by my words preceded on Elster's face the indifferent, absent-minded air which a moment later he displayed there. "Quick, give it to me," he cried. "I hear Madame Elster coming, and though, I assure you, the young person in the billycock hat never played any part in my life, still there's no point in my wife's coming in and finding it staring her in the face. And I have kept it only as an amusing sidelight on the theatre of those days." And, before putting it away behind the pile, Elster, who perhaps had not set eyes on the sketch for years, gave it his careful scrutiny. "I must keep just the head," he murmured. "The lower part is really too shockingly bad. The hands are a beginner's work." I was miserable at the arrival of Madame Elster, who could only delay us still further. The window-sill was already aglow. Our excursion would be a pure waste of time. There was no longer the slightest chance of our seeing the girls. Consequently, it mattered now not at all how soon Madame Elster left us, or how long she stayed. Not that she did stay for any length of time. I found her most tedious. She might have been beautiful once at 20, driving an ox in the Roman Campagna, but her dark hair was streaked with gray, and she was common without being simple, because she believed that a pompous manner and majestic attitudes were required by her statuesque beauty, which, however, advancing age had robbed of all its charm. She was dressed with the utmost simplicity, and it was touching, but at the same time surprising to hear Elster, whenever he opened his mouth, and with a respectful gentleness, as if merely uttering the words moved him to tenderness and veneration, repeat, "My beautiful Gabrielle." Later on, when I had become familiar with Elster's mythological paintings, Madame Elster acquired beauty in my eyes also. I understood, then, that to a certain ideal type illustrated by certain lines, certain arabesques, which reappeared incessantly throughout his work, to a certain canon of art he had attributed a character that was almost divine, since the whole of his time, all the mental effort of which he was capable, in a word, his whole life he had consecrated to the task of distinguishing those lines as clearly, and of reproducing them as faithfully as possible. What such an ideal inspired in Elster was indeed a cult so solemn, so exacting, that it never allowed him to be satisfied with what he had achieved, was the most intimate part of himself, and so he had never been able to look at it from a detached standpoint, to extract emotion from it, until the day on which he encountered it, realized outside, apart from himself, in the body of a woman, the body of her who in due course became Madame Elster, and in whom he had been able, as one is able only with something that is not oneself, to find it meritorious, moving, godlike. How comforting, moreover, to let his lips rest upon that beauty which hitherto he had been obliged with so great labor to extract from within himself, whereas now, mysteriously incarnate, it offered itself to him in a series of communions filled with saving grace. End of section 39.